Every now and then, we need a list, right? Last week, I went to Costco, and I remembered the hamburger buns, and the paper plates, and the paper cups. But I forgot the hot dogs, because they weren't on the list. Every now and then, we need a list. Back in the 1980s, early 90s, my organizational life was revolutionized by a friend when he introduced me to a system of planning that he had just come across called the Franklin Planning System. I bought the books, the calendars, the inserts, the page dividers, the whole 9 yards. Spent tons of money on the Franklin Planning System, which seemed to me to be an ingenious way. It worked so well for me, but basically the system hung on the common wisdom that when you need to remember something, you make a list. Today's section of the book of Hebrews is basically a list. Chapter 13 is a list that offers suggestions on how the members of the first century Christian community, fledgling Christian community in the Middle East, should act toward one another. The end of the previous chapter of Hebrews, chapter 12, this same author was using glorious grand text to help us picture God as a consuming fire with a voice that shakes the earth in a day that was coming for all of us to dread. Then chapter 13, he kind of dials it back a little bit and says essentially, but in the meantime, here's what you can do to live decent lives. So, here on this Labor Day weekend, before all the calamity of our lives begins to happen, and we go back to school, or back to work, or back to whatever normal looks like, here's a list we can put in our pocket and take with us. Number 1 on the list, let love be mutual. Sounds pretty innocuous, okay, whatever, that's a good thing. But while it might sound relatively benign, there is a lot to be said for the kind of love that puts the well-being of the other person, the other, front and center. A mutuality in love. To love with mutuality means to constantly temper the I in our relationships. To love with mutuality is to be overjoyed at the success of someone else, regardless of how that might or might not reflect on us. In his book, The Second Mountain, David Brooks shares his perspective on this kind of mutual love by suggesting that the second mountain we climb in our lives, the one that awaits us after we've established ourselves in the world, our occupation, the things that we do, the second mountain, the meaning mountain, is all about the relationships that we have with other people and how we are able to develop and deepen those relationships, how we are able to deepen our commitment to those we love. In the book, he tells the story of a special kind of mutuality when he tells the story of Sarah Heminger. Sarah Heminger is the founder of Thread, which is a not-for-profit mentoring organization right here in Baltimore City. Some of y'all may have heard of it. When Sarah was a child in Indiana, a small town in Indiana, their family was church people, like a lot of folks in Indiana are. And they went to this church, and Sarah's father discovered in the course of being a volunteer in that church that the popular, charismatic Pied Piper pastor of their church was dipping into the church funds. And so he reported this to the congregation, figuring it was the right thing to do. But instead of disciplining or even firing the pastor, this beloved pastor was was assisted by his community. They took his side, and Sarah and her family during her formative years was ostracized in that small town in Indiana. She spent 8 years of her childhood and adolescence without the kind of support and friendship that most of us rely on during that time. Well, after she grew up, she left Indiana. One day she was working on a PhD at Hopkins Hospital. Sarah realized, maybe it was even on her way to work, that she was lonely again, like she had been lonely when she was a teenager. Faced with a mountain of work, faced with all of these deadlines, she began wondering about her purpose and why she was climbing this PhD mountain. She just happened to be driving out towards Hopkins, driving by Dunbar High School on her way to the hospital. So she stopped, she got out of the car, she parked, she got out of the car, she went in and asked for a meeting with the principal there at Dunbar, and they met. And then they continued to meet. They had a series of meetings until she finally talked the principal into giving her the names of 6 underperforming students who agreed, after she met with them and plied by pizza and soda, agreed to join in the program she had envisioned. Before long, Sarah had talked dozens of fellow Hopkins students into volunteering, driving kids to and from school, bringing them their lunch when they didn't have one otherwise, driving them back to school when they left at lunchtime, helping them with homework, all with a weekend camping trip as a reward. Sarah Heminger surrounded otherwise lonely kids with community, and to make a long story very short, Thread has now woven a web of support around over 400 students, using volunteers, each of whom commits to at least 6 years of service. Now, mutual love doesn't always look as heroic as that. Sometimes, most times, it's much more modest. But I wonder how our lives might change if we taped a message to our bathroom mirror that reminded us every morning or asked us, who will be the recipient of my love today? And I wonder how our congregational life might begin to evolve and change if we thought of our own mission as a call to surround those who would otherwise be lonely with a web of mutual love. Item number 2 on the list. Do not neglect to show hospitality. While Jana and I were at the General Assembly in Des Moines this summer, our church meets every other year for a national meeting. Someone walked up to us in the display area and very kindly shared a memory of a sermon that we preached at that same assembly way back in 2003. Said, I think of your sermon every time I drive into my garage. Every time I drive up to my house, push open the garage door from the remote in my car, disappear into the garage, and push the door back so that it closes behind me. His comment reminded us that in that sermon, we talked about how so many houses now, this was 2003, have big garages that face the street. They're built so that the garage is the most prominent part of the house. Garages that swallow us up before we have a chance to visit with our neighbors. If houses have porches or patios or decks, they're in the back, and they're usually surrounded by privacy fences. But once upon a time, the porches of houses were on the fronts of houses, and those porches created a middle space where neighboring could happen. Hospitality could be shared. It's not as much the case anymore, is it? We live in an age where, I don't know about you, but I'm reluctant even to answer the door when someone knocks. I figure someone trying to sell me something. Anything from Jesus to store windows. We live in a time when we don't even answer the phone, right? Unless we know who's on the other end. We're not going to risk that. And we live in a time when our homes are considered more as nests for those we already know than for places where we might invite others in, or platforms where we might lead. All of which makes the job of figuring out how to offer hospitality even more challenging and important. Now, at the risk of patting ourselves on the back, I loved the feel of our Music on the Hill event last Sunday because it felt like a front porch event. It felt like the church creating a safe space for things like joy, and music, and food, and kids, and conversation. All that we lacked was the porch swing. A community of well-being, offering hospitality. I think the author of Hebrews encourages always to do that. Item number 3, let marriage be held in honor by all. Again, this bit of advice seems like, well, duh, of course. But then we hear all these horror stories. Stories about violating trust. Stories about infidelity. Stories about predators. And what do you know? Way too many of those stories are taking place as part of the life of churches. And then, when the church has so often caused all this kind of pain, we have the gall in that same church to judge others based on who they choose to marry. Go figure. So the author of Hebrews says, let marriage, all marriage, be held in honor. Let church be a place where covenant is honored, whatever it looks like. Item number 4, remember those who are in prison. Now, to be fair, this was written in a time when folks were being imprisoned for their faith, and they're being imprisoned often on a pretty regular basis. That doesn't happen anymore, except for some of us, maybe overnight, if we were involved in a protest or something. Our lives may not unfold in such a way that we will ever have the occasion to be inside a prison. I wonder how many of us here have ever been inside the walls of a prison. Not too many of us, perhaps. Having said that, I must also say that having that experience of being inside of a prison is transformational. For me, when we had one of our members in one of our churches in prison, judgment was always replaced by a sense of humility whenever we visited, as the door behind me slammed shut before the one in front of me in the wheelhouse could open. And as I left after each visit, I was always just overcome by a sense of gratitude for all the reasons in my life, all the relationships and support that have saved me from such a fate. Remembering those in prison makes us better. Remembering the sense of justice and injustice that can come along with prison life makes us better. Item number 5 on the list, keep your lives free from the love of money. Okay? Once upon a time, there was an NFL quarterback who played for the Colts, Indianapolis Colts, who lost millions of dollars by stepping away from the game that was killing his joy and shortening his life. Keep your lives free from the love of money. Once upon a time, there was a family, sisters and their husbands, brothers and all their children, family, happy family, doting family, a family that has been torn apart because of money. We've heard perhaps about the prosperity gospel, which believes that money is a sign of blessing from God. Here, Hebrews says, keep your lives free from the love of money. We know we're not supposed to love money, but then what do we do instead? I don't think we're called to be lavish necessarily, foolish with our money, but we are called to be generous with what we have, because that generosity can transform us. There's no getting around it, folks. Generosity and money, most often used topic in the Bible. I wonder how any of us who might be here today who have a decision to make might weigh in with that decision by remembering to temper our love of money. And finally, and this is a great item on the list, remember your leaders. Who do you suppose this Why do you suppose this item is on the list? Maybe it's because who leads us is so important. We have a choice in that, right? Who leads us is so important. Maybe it's because we need to affirm those who are willing to step forward and take the risk of leadership, whatever the organization might be. Maybe it's because we need to hold our leaders accountable. Maybe saying remember your leaders is a way of saying there isn't much that's more important in a church, in an organization, in a society than developing new leaders. Or maybe saying remember your leaders is a way of suggesting that there are all kinds of ways to lead. There are out front ways to lead, and then there are leadership styles that quietly make things happen. It was George Eliot who said this in the last sentence of his novel Middlemarch. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. And that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the numbers who lived faithful, hidden lives and rest in unvisited tombs. Let's remember our leaders, those upon whom the light shines, and others too. And with that, we have our list to tuck into our backpack, our list to save in our Franklin planner, or to type into our notes app into our phone. Here's our list to take with us, as long as we remember, of course, that we are always more than the list of things that we either do or aren't able to do on a given day. And that there is only ever one item on God's to-do list, and that is to love us without condition. Through Jesus Christ, our servant, our leader, and our friend. Amen.